Okay, good morning, everybody. We're at 9:30, and amazingly enough, we're only, again, going to cover 1/3 of a lesson today, but there's an awful lot of material in it. We covered 1/3 of Lesson 1 last time, and so we've got, as the lesson is divided into 12 chapters, we're taking 4 of these chapters at a time. We'll begin by watching the video for chapter 5.
Creationists, most of them have been evolutionists, just like I was. I was an atheist, an evolutionist, and I believed in the billions of years that were alleged for the age of the world. When I became a creationist, I was convinced by the scientific evidence that there was no evolution and billions of years didn't happen. So I changed glasses, I changed worldviews. So most creationists are like that. They have seen the world through at least 2 pairs of glasses. And so creationists are much more conscious of how worldview affects your interpretation. Creationists know how evolutionists think, having been that way ourselves, but most evolutionists don't really understand how creationists think.
I would argue that the Christian worldview alone is the only philosophy that is self-consistent and will make knowledge possible. Any other philosophy ultimately will lead to contradictions. It will end up refuting itself. And that's something the Bible tells us in Proverbs 1:7. It says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction." The scriptures make clear you either start with biblical presuppositions, a God-honoring biblical worldview, or you're reduced to foolishness.
I take as one of my primary assumptions that God exists, that He's real, that He has revealed Himself through His Word to us, the Bible.
The Christian worldview can make sense of those assumptions. Of course my senses are going to be basically reliable if God created them. Of course that makes sense. On the other hand, evolution cannot make sense of those basic assumptions that we all take for granted. If evolution were true, then why would my senses be basically reliable? If they're just the results of, rearranged pond scum, why would we expect them to be reliable? And so the Christian worldview can make sense of those basic, what we call presuppositions, your most basic assumptions about reality, and secular worldviews really can't.
Evolutionists, most of them, have only seen the world through evolutionary glasses. Every scientist does this. You establish a set of worldviews about how you think things work and have worked and how we got here. And then you try to funnel all the data you get into that framework. The evolutionist is not conscious most of the time that he is viewing the world this way, that his worldview is shaping how he interprets data. And if you have data that doesn't fit the worldview very much, you kind of push it aside. If you assume that the universe has been here a very long time, then you're going to be interpreting evidence in that way. You'll assume that all fossil layers were laid down at today's very slow rate. And so you'll look at the Grand Canyon and see miles of fossil layers, and you'll say, well, that took a long time to deposit. Of course, nothing like the Genesis flood could have deposited them. So the worldview assumption that the earth is very old shapes one's view about how the layers in the Grand Canyon got deposited.
Choosing between the two is not simply a matter of looking at data and saying, where does the evidence go? Because there's spiritual implications. We are at heart all sinners, and we are rebellious against our Creator. I fought that for a long time, even though I saw data, I saw science. No, because of where it leads to. It leads to me having accountability. But I think a lot of the rejection of Christianity comes from that. There's an atheist philosopher, I think it was Nagel, who mentioned something along the lines of, I don't want the universe to be that way. So that sort of sums it all up.
Okay, let's start by looking at page 17 there, the first sheet that you've got there in your packet this morning, which starts to talk about the choosing between two worldviews, and it summarizes it in there are only two worldviews. There's the naturalistic worldview, it just came to be, or there is the created worldview where everything was made by someone. And near the end of the video selection, you had that quote from Thomas Nagel. That is reprinted more in full there on page 17. I just want to read the bold parts there, the parts in bold. I speak from experience, being strongly subject to this fear myself. I want atheism to be true and am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are believers. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. So, I don't know a whole lot about Thomas Nagel as far as what he did in his life, what he came up with as far as his philosophies. He's a professor of philosophy and law. But I do know that this is his starting point. He doesn't want there to be a God. He is unnerved by the idea of God. And he's made uncomfortable by the fact that people he knows who are smart people accept the fact that there's a God. And he doesn't want things to be that way. So, although I don't know his work, I know that everything that he did flowed out of that worldview. That's how he saw everything. That he looked at things and had, as was mentioned in the first part of the video, those glasses on. Well, we know there's no God. There can't be a God. I really don't want there to be a God. So there must be a different way to interpret all of this. And then you have on page 18 there the logical conclusion to an objective view of science that leads you to see that there is a creator. Romans 1:18 through 20. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God hath showed it unto them. They can see, or as the songwriter says, every house is built by somebody. God is the builder of everyone. They can see the intelligent design in the human eye. They can see the code inside of DNA, plant, animal, and human. But they don't want to admit that there's a creator, because then that leads to implications. And we'll talk about those a little bit later too. So to the questions there for the chapter, number one, many creationists who used to be evolutionists know that this one thing affects how they interpret the world around them. What is it? Well, what do they have then? Their own opinion, which is their worldview. Their worldview. Your worldview is going to shape how you see everything. And it's not just true in the realm of science, by the way. It's true in the realm of politics. It's true in the realm of news reporting. If you want to understand what's being said to you on the news, you should know who the people on the news are who are telling you certain things and what their worldview is, because that shapes how they tell you things. And, well, I think we've seen it especially the last 5-6 years. If you don't examine the worldview of the people who are telling you things, you are going to just be told all sorts of stuff that may or may not be true, but knowing their worldview can help you evaluate the truth or the likelihood that what they're saying is true. Yeah.
So, like they said, it depends on what pair of glasses you have on.
Exactly. As an exercise in this, I remember a professor of mine handed us all a piece of paper that had a description of the Soviets entering Berlin at the end of World War II, and all of the descriptors of how the victorious Red Army came in and liberated Berlin from the trials and tribulations of Nazism and so on and so forth. And it looked like it came out of a Pravda or something like that, like it was Russian propaganda or something. Said, no, this was a United States Army textbook that's used at West Point. And you're like, why would they talk about? Well, that's the worldview of the author. The worldview permeates everything that a person says or does. And it should be true of us too. Our worldview should permeate everything that we think and say and do. Number 2, true or false, a scientist does not allow his worldview to affect his interpretation of the facts.
He may say he does, but it's false.
We know better. It just can't happen because if it was completely objective, then those who teach and promote macroevolution would have to admit to all of the logical fallacies and contradictions inside of that, and they don't. Instead they say, well, we're just looking for the missing link. Well, we're just looking for the thing that's going to make this all fit together because we know it fits together. It has to. Because the only other possibility is that there's a God, and we don't want that. You have the little aside there with the Grand Canyon there. You go to the Grand Canyon, and they'll tell you how many millions and millions of years it took for each layer to be put down and everything. But they won't tell you the evidence for the impossibility of a large period of time, even thousands of years in the Grand Canyon, which is specifically the bending of the strata, which tells you that the strata must have been pliable, almost like it was all really wet or something. But it hadn't hardened. And if it had been hardened, as you would expect, over millions of years for each strata, there would be cracks and fissures everywhere in the strata, and there aren't. That's evidence for the worldwide flood, but that isn't talked about. So, because it doesn't fit the worldview of the scientists. Number 3, why could we not trust our reason if there is nothing more than natural processes?
It says here, if evolution is true, it means our senses and brains are the result of random natural processes. And there'd be no order or rhyme to anything.
Right. If evolution is true, you are a product of evolution, and for all you know, you're not a finished product yet. For all you know, there's something better to come along, and why would you trust your eyes, your ears, your sense of touch, or your ability to reason anything out? Because
There's something better than me coming? I thought that was pretty great.
well, yeah, you didn't see the first Star Trek movie? No. Oh, okay.
Actually, Star Trek movie? No. I
Okay.
never saw that.
They tell you what the next stage of evolution is anyway. But, number 4, true or false? A scientist that believes only in natural process will often filter their conclusions based on disagreement with the spiritual implications. Well, we've got at least one scientist who admits as much when he says, I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that.
When he's saying that he doesn't want there to be a God, it almost sounds like he's saying there is a God.
He's admitting there's evidence for God in a sense, yes.
He's saying I don't want there to be, but
No.
there is.
There are, when you want to really dig into it, there are 2 levels of discussion among people who believe in and promote evolution. And then there are the discussions that we see played out in high school, college textbooks. Like, this is what happened, this was the Mesolithic age, and this age, and so on and so forth. And that's the way it is. Then there are the internal discussions, when they're like, how in the world do we make this work? And every so often you can find details of those internal discussions, discussions back and forth. People would say, this just doesn't work. There's an awful lot of self-doubt there, as you would expect, because there are so many contradictions that don't fulfill a scientist. Okay, and then some of the more basic questions about the video. Why in the video does Dr. Liesel say that the Christian worldview alone is the only philosophy that is self-consistent and will make knowledge possible? It aligns with our senses, yes, and it eliminates the problem of contradictions. What's the solution to every seeming contradiction? Well, we have an all-wise, all-powerful God.
Okay, you said it aligns to our senses and what?
It aligns with our senses and it eliminates contradictions because it just puts all the contradictions in the hands of an all-wise, all-powerful God. We can say, well, that's his doing and his logic is beyond ours.
He said too that the other worldview, the non-Christian worldview, your balance will run into contradiction.
Yeah, there are inevitable contradictions, unsolvable contradictions. Just the one we talked about with the strata in the Grand Canyon. They can't figure that out. You look up at the top of page 19 there. All of the evidences of sudden fossilization. The jellyfish in Mozini, the fish coming out of another fish's mouth, a dinosaur giving birth, a Morella splendens caught in the act of molting, dinosaur skin. That shouldn't happen. I mean, it should be a partially decomposed body that's been laying at rest for some time, that then over a very, very long period of time is fossilized. But not only are these fossils sometimes caught in these fossilized animals fossilized in the act of just living, so they were fossilized suddenly. There have been evidences found of soft tissue DNA, which ought to have decomposed millions of years ago.
I've read that there's been this place called the Body Farm. It's near like the FBI training center and stuff. And they followed like how long it takes a body to decompose, and they said it can be done in like 6 months or less, the whole body. And then you go back to the Egyptians, how they mummified their bodies, and they did that within days of the death. So how can they say fossils didn't have millions of
Well,
years?
it's just another one of the many contradictions that can't be answered. Number 3, in the video, Dr. Humphreys says an evolutionist may not even realize how his worldview is shaping his conclusions. Why do you think that's true? Even with the inherent bias that we all come at things with, an evolutionist can say, well, I'm the one who's not biased. How do you think they get away with telling themselves that?
They don't want to acknowledge there's a God.
Right, they don't. But then also, when it comes to the concept of God, they're saying we're the objective ones. I mean, if there's a God who comes along and he puts a display out there and he introduces himself to me personally and says, okay, I'll understand that there's a God. Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist, said, if he ever meets God, and he doesn't think there's a God, but he ever meets God, the first thing he'll say to him is, why, sir, did you not make yourself known to me? So they've got the excuse. Whoever this God is, God didn't introduce himself. He doesn't make himself known. We are the objective ones because we don't come into our scientific observation with the bias of religious belief. Because they've thrown off religious belief, they can think of themselves as unbiased when it comes to interpreting everything. But what they don't recognize is by throwing off religious belief, they have already taken a bias upon themselves and said, we're biased against religious belief. We don't like it. We don't want it. Number 4, how does a completely naturalistic worldview affect a person's conclusions about the age of the earth? Because it has to. In recorded history, we don't have any record of species evolving into species So that must take a really, really long time, and so thus we have to have a very large expanse of time for life to begin, for life to develop, for life to morph and change and evolve. Because we know that there's no God, thus time and death. Remember, it was Carl Sagan who said that. Those are the two elements of evolution. You need time and you need death. And number 5, in the video, Spikesaurus says a scientist cannot sometimes follow where the data alone would lead because of spiritual implications. What does he mean by that? Well, it really goes back to the passage from Romans that we talked about there on page 18. If there is a creator God, that means he created me. That means I am responsible to him, she, it, whatever that creator God is. That means I'd better examine my life and see if I've done what this being expects of me. And if not, then what? If the DNA coding, which follows a mathematical formula that so obviously did not just arise out of nothing, if that's telling me that someone created everything, I owe allegiance and obedience to this creator somehow, and I better find out who that creator is and what this creator expects of me. And that's a place where a scientist, an evolutionary scientist, doesn't want to go at all. All right, so let's pick it up with chapter 6 then.
The difficulty in deciding what happened in the past is you're not able to directly observe this. We frequently make this distinction between what we call operational science and historical science. The evolutionists don't like that, but it's okay. It's still a valid thing to point out.
And astronomy is difficult because we can't bring things into the laboratory and do experiments. I mean, you can't bring a star into your lab bench and play with it. There's also, with few exceptions, we haven't visited these objects either. I mean, we visited a few planets with a few spacecraft, and that's about it. So for the most part, we're taking pictures of objects from very far away and trying to figure out, A, what they're doing today, and B, what they were like in the past.
There's a scripture in Ecclesiastes that Gerald Ardsman used to like to quote. What has happened is remote and exceedingly distant. Who can understand it? We are talking about things that we can't lay hold of. We don't have a nice time machine. We can't go back and see what happened and record what happened. So we have to look at the evidence left by all the events that happened, and there are different ways to interpret that evidence, and your presuppositions get into that interpretation very strongly.
So there's assumptions you have to make in order to do that. And part of the difficulty is that in a lot of these cases, there's a lot of possible past scenarios that would still produce the same result we see today. How do you know which of those past scenarios is correct? We have to make a lot of assumptions in order to do that, and there's no way to verify those assumptions. Your assumptions might be wrong, your conclusions might be wrong. How do you know? They all produce the same effect, which is what we see in space today.
Many times people say, well, disbelieving evolution is like disbelieving gravity. We can test any theory of gravity. In fact, general theory of relativity is being tested all the time in all sorts of experiments and doing quite well with that, thank you. If somebody comes up with an alternate, say, I don't believe the theory of gravity we have, here's a better theory, then we can build a piece of equipment, we can go into a lab, we can put something in spacecraft in orbit, whatever we do. We can do some sort of experiment to test this. Creation or evolution, that is a past process. How can you devise an experiment in the here and now that will allow you to find out what happened in the past to things like, for instance, dinosaurs? What happened to them? That's a past process. Sort of like forensic science. You can never totally recreate a crime scene, no matter how careful you are. Furthermore, who's to say that some other sort of explanation could suffice? That's the whole point of a criminal case, the trial many times, is that you've got the prosecution spinning one theory to explain all the details, and you've got the defense putting forth a different theory. And they both cannot be true. They both could be false, but they both can't be true simultaneously. And we're dealing with the past process. And there are many situations where people found out later that their interpretation of past processes, be in science or be in forensics, has been wrong. And so the standards of proof are not the same when you're talking about past processes and current processes. The way I like to illustrate this is with the late Carl Sagan. Over 30 years ago, he had a popular TV series on PBS, at that point the most popular, and for a number of years afterwards it was. And he had a statement very early on in that, in the book and in the video series. The universe is all there ever has been, and all there ever will be. And many people hearing that or reading that say, wow, what a profound scientific statement. There's not a bit of science in this. He's asserted three things. First of all, the universe is all that there is right now. It's a denial of a spiritual reality. It's a denial that God exists. He can't prove that, but it's what it is. Then he said that it's all the universe that ever has existed. That means God has never existed, or nothing outside of the natural or physical world has existed in the past. And it's all ever will exist. It's an assertion that the natural world is all there is and all there will be. Well, how could Carl Sagan know that with any certainty? Well, he'd have to be able to step outside of the world and look and see that there's nothing outside of the world. He'd have to also not only do it now, but every time in the past and every time in the future. Well, obviously he couldn't do that, because to do that you'd have to be God, which he has assumed doesn't exist. So it's an assertion of his worldview. There's no science in it. That's fine as long as you recognize it's his worldview. And that's the kind of thing totally opposite of what I'm talking about. He starts with that worldview, and so if he concludes that God doesn't exist, I'm not surprised, because he assumed to start out that God did not exist. He said, I don't see any evidence there, proof that God exists. Well, of course not. You're not looking at it properly. You've also decided that science is only dealing with the physical world, which it is, but if you don't believe the supernatural world exists, the spiritual world, then why would you expect to see physical, natural evidence of that beyond those things? You make that assumption, and you end up with a certain set of conclusions because of the assumptions that you've made. And it's very tough to get outside of either one of those boxes and view the world differently.
Okay, so we had the quote by Carl Sagan was referenced there on page 21, and we'll tackle the questions right away. Page 22, what two types of science did the video talk about? Historical and operational. Number 2, what are the three main criteria for something to be considered operational science? How about we say it can be observed? It can be observed. It can be tested. And it can be replicated. You can see it and then make deductions from it. You can test it and make sure that what you're seeing is actually true, what you think it is. And you can replicate it and say, okay, that's how it happened. Let's see if we can do that again. So, number 3, would theories about the origin of the universe be more likely operational science or historical science?
I'd say historical because, one, you can't test it, you can't replicate it, and you can't really observe like what happened like 2 years ago.
Yeah. It is historical science. It's taking what you can observe today and drawing conclusions based on what you can draw today and extrapolating that back into the past and drawing conclusions about the past from that. So, number 4, why can we compare historical science to a criminal case trial? What two parties do you have going against each other in a criminal case trial? Okay, you've got the prosecution and you've got the defense. The prosecution says what? You did this. The defense says, no, I did not do that. Can both of those things be true? Nope. Each presents their version of reality, but in the end only one reality can be true. Historical science can come up with all sorts of different explanations for the past. We can get to where we are through all sorts of different theories of what happened in the past. But they can't all be true. Only one can be true. Number 5, what was Carl Sagan's primary assumption in the example given above? What did he say about the universe?
This is all there is, this is all there was, and this will all be there is to be.
This is all there is. There is no spiritual world. There never was anything other than the universe, and there never will be. And if that's his opinion, he's free to say that. He said that. That's fine. He could say that. But he can't say that that's science. Not operational science. And note, too, that something they said at the beginning of this chapter of the video, an evolutionist doesn't want to make this distinction between historical science and operational science. So just say, it's science. You got to trust the science. And the science leads you to where the science leads you, but the science of gravity is not the same as the science of evolution. The science of evolution is not reproducible, hasn't been observed, and can't be tested. There are plenty of other scientific theories that can be tested, have been proven. This one can't because it's a different type of science. And they say, but it's the science. Well, it's one person's interpretation of the science. That doesn't necessarily mean it's true. Science is always changing in the sense of what science truly is. The compendium of human knowledge. Human knowledge is growing, changing, and sometimes being rewritten, like, oh, now we know this, where a few years ago we didn't know this. Now we know this is true. So you can never at any point in time say, well, the science says this, case closed. Because science changes. And sometimes science changes because sometimes a scientist's bias is shown. And then you know, oh, okay, what that scientist said can't be counted on anymore. There's no shortage to the number of scientific journals and articles that have been written that have then been debunked because, well, this particular scientist had an agenda that he or she was trying to push. That happens. So too, when it comes to macroevolution, there is an agenda. We don't want any God, thus we'll rule out any possibility of there being God, and we'll proceed from that standpoint. All right, we'll cover chapter 7 yet before we take a break.
I think there are things in the universe we see that can tell us about our origins. One thing I like to talk about is the first and second law of thermodynamics. The first law of thermodynamics is a conservation principle that there's no more energy being made. Energy is neither created nor is it destroyed. We used to have the conservation of mass. We still talk about that. Same sort of thing. The matter can neither be created nor destroyed. Now, we've discovered in the past century that that's not quite true because, as Albert Einstein argued, I think in 1905, energy and mass are equivalent things. E equals mc squared gives you the equivalence there. So to modify that today, we would say that the total mass energy of the universe remains constant, neither created nor destroyed. Having clarified that, that would seem to rule out that the universe could have come into existence by itself. If you suddenly have the appearance of matter and energy, that would seem to violate the first law of thermodynamics, which is a very fundamental thing we see about the universe. But the second law has an interesting thing to say. It says the amount of usable energy out there is always diminishing. We have different ways of expressing it. By the way, the second law is a very slippery concept. Just when I think I've got a hold of it, I get mugged by something I didn't really realize before. But you can state it a number of different ways. One of the statements, again, is the usable energy gets less and less. The energy gets dispersed and less available to us. We call this entropy, and entropy is increasing. That's a measure of how much unusable energy there is or how much disorder there is in the universe. If you extrapolate that into the past, you'll find out that the universe in the past must have been very ordered. The energy must have been very useful. And if you go back and back and back into the past, you have a problem because you reach a point of infinite order and infinite usefulness which doesn't exist today. So there's been a change from that. And how did it ever get started? So the first law by itself seems to suggest the universe did not have a beginning. And the second law argues that it must have had a beginning. So you get these two very fundamental laws that seem to be universal that have this tremendous amount of tension. Both are true, but ultimately in the past, they couldn't have both been operating as they are today. And to me, that tells me there's an interruption of the way the world normally works. We have this world that seems to have universal law that seems to govern it. That would be the upholding of the world by the power of God's Word. I believe that we're seeing the manifestation there. But ultimately, the two laws, when taken together, seem to indicate very strongly that the universe had a non-physical, non-natural sort of origin. And I think that argues very strongly for something, how the world came to be, that we will never be able to probe because it would violate physical principles to do that. And that, to me, indicates a supernatural origin.
Okay, just some quick physics review here from your high school physics classes. Number 1 on page 24, true or false? The first law of thermodynamics describes how new energy and matter can be created. Linda's saying false. No, nothing can be created. No new energy or matter can be created. Matter, according to Einstein's theory of relativity, matter can be transformed into energy, but the constant of the amount of energy and matter together in the universe never changes. There's always the same amount of energy, there's always the same amount of matter. You can't destroy matter. I mean, you can blow something up, but it's still matter, it's just in little pieces all over the place. Matter is matter, energy is energy, and sometimes matter can transform into energy, but there isn't new matter and new energy being created. True or false? Number 2, the second law of thermodynamics says there is increasing order in the universe. False. This is the law of entropy, which says things are naturally going to get worse. Things naturally tend towards disorder when left alone. And that's the case. If you abandoned your house for the next 20 years and then went back to visit your house and nobody had gone in there, would your house look better or worse all by itself? It would look worse. Things would have deteriorated. There would be wood. Your wood beams would have been rotting, and then your roof opens up, and then rain gets in. Things deteriorate by themselves. They don't get better and more orderly by themselves. That's Newton's second law of thermodynamics. But now comes the theory of evolution, which says, oh, no, things are actually getting better. And someone once compared the theory of evolution to the idea of a tornado whipping through a junkyard and assembling a 747. No, it's going to produce more chaos, a tornado ripping through a junkyard. It isn't going to produce order, it's going to produce more chaos. That's Newton's second law of thermodynamics. Number 3, true or false? The second law of thermodynamics says the amount of usable energy is decreasing. Yes, the energy is diffusing and our ability to harness it then is decreasing. When you burn gasoline in your automobile, you can't harness the exhaust, turn it back into the same gasoline and use it again. Energy is decreasing. So number 4, what tension is there between the first and second laws of thermodynamics when it comes to the origin of the universe?
First say it was always there, there was like no beginning.
The first says there is no creation of new matter. Yes, there's no creation of matter and energy. It's just there as constant. But the second law says that we are in a more entropic state than we were in the past. So if we go back in time, we find more and more order. Well, where did the order come from? Well, number 5, how are these two laws resolved with how do these two laws resolve with the creation worldview? Naturally, this can't happen. Naturally, you can't solve the contradiction between the first law of thermodynamics. Created matter can't just be created, or energy just can't be created. It has to be there as a constant. And things tend to devolve, get worse, entropy over time. But creation says there was a creator who called everything into being by the power of his word. Someone outside of the boundaries of science said, let there be light. Let there be sun, moon, and stars. Let there be frogs and elephants and hippopotamuses and so on. He had the power to do that, but it takes a supernatural explanation to understand the natural world that we live in. Okay, so we'll take our break now and come back and finish with chapter 8 for today then. So.
I think she's the official New Year of Sunday. And we won't be there either. It's her birthday weekend and everything. Nature cheesecake. We'll be back on Tuesday.
All right, welcome back. We are going to pick it up with the video for Chapter 8.
There are various lines of evidence in the universe that lend themselves very naturally to a creation interpretation and are really sticking points for those who believe in a naturalistic origin for the universe. Some of those, for example, would be, how do you make a star? My secular colleagues believe that stars form from nebulae, which is a large cloud of hydrogen and helium gas, made of the same stuff as stars. And so they say, oh, maybe that's where stars come from. The idea is the nebula is supposed to collapse in on itself and form a star. But the problem is the gas pressure in a nebula tends to resist any compression. Now, there is gravity pulling in on it, but in a typical region of space, the force of gas pressure in a nebula is much larger than the force of gravity. And so I'm very skeptical that a nebula could ever collapse to form a star. And so if stars cannot form naturalistically, and we do have them, they had to have been created supernaturally.
It's difficult to figure out what happened in the past because the only observations we can make are here in the present. We do have methods for determining things in the past. They're historical methods, not scientific methods. But that generally applies to things that happened on Earth for which we have eyewitness accounts, testimony, written records, that sort of thing. None of that is obviously available to us when you're talking about astronomy. We look in the solar system, there's planets. That doesn't tell us how they used to be or what they used to look like or whatever. All we can see is the ones we have today. Now we can construct models and say, well, maybe they were like this in the past, but how do you verify that one of those models is true? I mean, if you think about it, there's an infinite number of stories you can create, each of which has the planet Jupiter in its current orbit today at the end of the story. How do you distinguish among all those various, infinite permutations? Well, you can't. There's arbitrary choices people tend to make, and they'll say, well, this has been verified with a computer simulation. Well, again, there's an infinite number of computer simulations you can have. And today, in secular circles, as an example, to solve certain problems in the solar system, people are positing that the various planets all used to be in different places, and then they all moved around, and they slingshot this one through, this one out here, and there used to be other planets that are no longer there anymore. How do you verify that there used to be a planet somewhere where that planet no longer exists? I mean, the evidence for this model is that the planet doesn't exist anymore, you don't see it. There are few places in science where you can say, the fact that I don't see something is evidence that it used to exist. But that's the ultimate implication of a lot of the models that are being portrayed nowadays.
Different models of origins, different models of the structure of the universe make different predictions about what we should see as we look deeper and deeper out into space. The Big Bang model had predicted that we should start to see galaxies just starting to form. They would say as you look out in space, you're looking back in time, is the way they like to think of it. That's not really true, but that's a can of worms there. But in any case, they would say, therefore, when you look back out in space, you're looking back closer to the Big Bang, and eventually you should see galaxies just starting to form. That's not what we see, though. We see galaxies fully formed, fully designed, in many cases spiral galaxies, out at tremendous distances where my secular colleagues were expecting them just to start forming. They're fully designed. And that in itself lends itself to a creation explanation. It makes perfect sense.
And they would expect to see fewer and fewer of what they call the heavy elements. These are anything heavier than helium, say lithium through oxygen, through carbon. They would expect to see fewer and fewer of those because they would have less and less of time for the supernovas to generate those elements. They don't see that. They see about the same abundances of those elements way out there as we do nearby. On the other hand, the creation cosmologies, so the ones that I've worked on, would expect to see something like what we're seeing. There's lots and lots of evidence like that. The spectral lines of stars and galaxies. We see evidence of the magnetic fields of stars and galaxies, and those look like a clue that God left behind to help us unravel things.
Okay, so this particular chapter's sticking points to the Big Bang. There are actually many more than were talked about here, but just the strictly scientific sticking points here. Number one, how do many secular scientists believe that stars form? Did you catch that, Linda?
That gases come together.
Yeah, the nebulae gases come together and form stars. Number two, what's the problem for secular star formation? That idea. The pressure in the nebula is greater than that of the gases that are being given off by the stars. So physically, from a physics perspective, it seems to be impossible. We've also never observed any nebulae coming together to make a star before either. We've seen nebulae, we've seen fully formed stars, but we've never seen this transitional stage where the nebulae come together into a star. And it doesn't seem to be physically possible for them to do that. Number three, what is wrong with computer models? And I wouldn't even phrase it that way. I'd say, what's the weakness of computer models?
Garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah, the computer model is only as good as the data that goes into it. Where do you rely on computer models every day?
The weather?
The weather. The weather is based on computer models. And the computer models, because there's an awful lot of present data that can be put into them, the computer models that our weather forecasters use are generally pretty reliable as far as computer models go. But they are far from perfect. In fact, it was just a few weeks ago when we had all that snow that came all of a sudden, and on the 10 p.m. news, the first thing they had was they had the weather guy come on and explain why he couldn't have predicted that. Like, well, we just didn't know. Like, well, because you didn't have the information you needed to put into the computer model. You know, it was always a thing living on the East Coast where the hurricane would be spinning off there off the coast of Africa, and the computer models would tell you where it's going to go, and you're like, oh, good. The computer models say there's nothing to worry about. Then a week later, it's like, oh, there's a new computer model. We'd better start battening down the hatches here because the earlier computer models relied on information that wasn't quite correct, or it was missing important data. And think of these computer models that are dealing with such small amounts of time, a week, 24 hours, and yet they can be compromised sometimes and not be entirely true. Can you just imagine the amount of possible error when you add a year, 10 years, 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years, 1,000,000,000 years to a computer model? How completely useless they are in predicting what's going to happen with a galaxy or a star or something like that. Just the amount of variables in that amount of time are so many, a computer model is just worthless. It's only as good as the information that goes in. And there's so much information lacking that a computer model, it might look really good in a video display, like this is what is going to happen and this is what we think did happen. And they've got the visuals to show you. But, Debbie.
Well, meteorologist is the only profession where you can be wrong most of the time.
Well, that and a Major League Baseball hitter. You could, yeah.
Could you also say artificial intelligence, all this AI is that kind of crap too? Like they're saying AI is going to take over the world and whatnot, but it's only as good as whoever puts it together.
It's a little bit more complex than that because AI has a learning ability on its own too. And it should be self-correcting, but it does have a starting point. You're right with that. And yeah.
As good as whoever programmed it.
Yeah. Number 4, why is the fact that we are seeing fully formed galaxies as far out as we can see a problem for the Big Bang model? Pardon?
It doesn't come from a time it would take to form heavier elements.
Right. And we should, if the Big Bang is true, be looking back in time when we look out thousands and thousands of light years out there, and we should be seeing the formation of galaxies then. But instead, everything we see is fully formed. The stars are formed, they're organized into galaxies, the galaxies are spinning and rotating. That shouldn't be. Number 5, why is it a problem for the Big Bang Theory that we see heavier elements far out into space? Now, I can't really speak to this. This is beyond my comprehension, but from what I've been told, the Big Bang could only have produced the lighter elements. Why, I don't know. If any of you know, feel free to enlighten me.
It's only gas to begin with.
Because it's only gas to begin with? Okay.
Heavier elements were formed over a period of time.
Sure. So yeah, you're not going to get uranium right away with the Big Bang. But
It's not like it was thousands of years or anything like that. The Big Bang happened within a short period of time, but within that period of time, there was age.
Mm-hmm.
There was a period of time.
but we look out, and it's supposedly looking back into time, deep into time, as we look out and to see these far-off galaxies. But instead of seeing just lighter elements, which haven't yet formed into heavier elements, we see the heavier elements. You can look through a telescope and use a spectrograph, and you can see the light that's being given off, and you can measure that light according to the radioactive code that each element has, and you can know what elements are out there in each particular star. That's a gross oversimplification, but it can be done. You can measure the elements that are out there, and we see heavier elements almost in the same proportions that we have here in our solar system. Yes?
Don't we see stars exploding, but they don't create new, life? They basically explode and they're no more?
Well, we see dissipation of stars, yeah. And I think we come to that in a later lesson, too. So,
Sorry, I did the dentist.
yeah, but...
What we see are fully formed.
We see fully formed galaxies with mature, heavy elements, as if, yeah, right, which of course leads itself to a creation worldview. So, okay, so guess what? Next time we'll do the last third of lesson 1, and we'll actually be done with lesson 1 in this. So, there's an awful lot of material. And you note, too, I am not reading all the introductory stuff, which sometimes is repeated in the video, but sometimes not. So some of the introductory summary stuff there of each of the chapters is worth your reading on your own. But we'd be here all morning if we took all that too. So, all right, let's just close with a short prayer. Lord God, Heavenly Father, we are like the psalm writer who looks up and sees the vastness of your creation and wonders, how is it that you are so loving and caring towards us human beings that you actually take a personal interest in us? But you do. You love us so much. You sent your Son to be our Savior. And you say that not even the hairs on our head can depart without you knowing about it and having care about it as well. Thank you for your providence, O God, and may we, as we continue to look at the wonders of your natural created order, continue to marvel at how wonderful and loving you are to us. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer.